June 19, 1944. The Philippine Sea burned beneath a sky of shattered clouds and vapor trails. At 10:35 a.m., Lieutenant Alex Vrasiu of the U.S. Navy throttled his Grumman F6F Hellcat into a climb so steep that the horizon vanished. The engine's roar filled his cockpit like thunder trapped inside steel. He spotted the glint of sunlight on the wings of incoming enemy aircraft, Mitsubishi A6M Zeros diving from the east. The Japanese formation spread wide, confident in their legendary agility. But within seconds, that confidence would crumble. As Vrasiu's Hellcat punched upward through the cloud bank, he fired a short burst. One Zero erupted into flame, then another. By the time he leveled out, 6 kills in 8 minutes were marked on his fuselage. His squadron, the High Hats of Fighting Squadron 16, would later call this day the Great Mariana's Turkey Shoot. What stunned the Japanese pilots most was not the accuracy of the Americans, but the impossible speed and climb of the aircraft they now faced. The sky itself had turned against them. 2 years earlier, such dominance would have been unthinkable. In 1942, the Zero had ruled the Pacific skies. Light, nimble, and deadly in a dogfight, it tore apart every Allied aircraft thrown against it. The Zero's designers at Mitsubishi had achieved the perfect predator for the early war. A fighter capable of a 6,000 foot per minute climb and acrobatic turns that no opponent could match. American pilots died by the dozens learning the hard truth. In a turning battle, the Zero was unbeatable. Yet even as those early defeats unfolded over Wake Island and the Coral Sea, engineers back home in Bethpage, New York, were quietly crafting the answer. Under the direction of Grumman's Leroy Grumman and his chief engineer William Schwendler, they designed a machine that could do what no Allied plane had yet done: climb faster, dive steeper, and survive hits that would tear any other aircraft apart. The first prototype flew in June 1942. They called it the Hellcat. At first glance, it seemed too heavy, too broad-winged, too blunt-nosed to dance with the agile Zero. But within its frame lay the miracle of American industry. The Hellcat's Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine produced over 2,000 horsepower, nearly double that of the Japanese fighter. It could climb 3,500 feet per minute, even with a full combat load, reaching altitudes above 30,000 feet, where the Zero's engines sputtered for air. Pilots soon discovered it could outturn the Zero above 15,000 feet and outdive it at any altitude. The secret wasn't just power, it was endurance. The Hellcat's armor, its self-sealing fuel tanks and its thick wings, turned dogfights into duels of patience, not fragility. "She could take punishment," one pilot wrote later, "and still bring you home." For the Japanese, the shock was immediate. At the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands in October 1942, their pilots first encountered the F-4F Wildcat's successor and assumed it was merely an improved version. But reports soon filtered back from surviving airmen, stories of American planes that climbed faster than the laws of aerodynamics should allow. Squadron leaders dismissed it as exaggeration until 1943, when captured fragments of a wrecked Hellcat revealed the truth. A radial engine so powerful it could tear the wings off if pushed too hard. Japanese engineers studied the remains in disbelief. The aircraft's design seemed crude, yet every bolt, every plate served a purpose. It was not beautiful like the Zero. It was brutal. In the months leading to the Marianas campaign, American carriers bristled with Hellcats. Each Essex-class ship carried nearly 40 of them, their blue-gray wings folded neatly along the decks. The pilots who flew them were not veterans of China or the early Pacific battles. They were young, often with less than 300 hours of flight time. But the machine beneath them forgave mistakes. In training exercises off Hawaii, pilots discovered that the Hellcat could recover from dives so steep that other fighters would have disintegrated. They learned to use vertical maneuvering instead of horizontal turns, to fight the Japanese not in circles, but in spirals. "Climb, roll, dive, repeat," their instructors said. The doctrine was simple: let the engine do the work. By mid-1944, Japan's Air Force was in crisis. The once feared Zero, the pride of the Imperial Navy, was now outclassed in almost every measurable way. Its airframe, built for range rather than durability, shattered under high-G turns. Its pilots, increasingly inexperienced, could not match the Americans' coordination. Radar guidance from ships and carrier controllers now directed Hellcats into perfect intercepts. When Japanese radar spotted an incoming strike, Hellcats were already waiting thousands of feet above. Japanese flight leader Lieutenant Junichi Sasai, before his death in combat, reportedly shouted over the radio, "They climb like rockets. These are not the same Wildcats." That disbelief echoed through squadron after squadron as Hellcats tore through formations that had once ruled the Pacific. What made the Hellcat truly terrifying was not only its speed or armor, it was its adaptability. Grumman's engineers built it to be manufactured fast, repaired faster, and flown by anyone who could hold a control stick. American factories rolled out over 12,000 of them between 1942 and 1945, each one crafted with interchangeable parts, so mechanics aboard carriers could rebuild damaged planes overnight. The Imperial Navy's maintenance crews, by contrast, struggled with shortages of fuel, aluminum, and spare engines. While Grumman's assembly lines in New York hummed 24 hours a day, Japan's factories in Nagoya and Yokosuka were being bombed into rubble. For every Zero produced, 3 Hellcats took flight. In combat, the difference showed. The Hellcats' pilots could climb into the sun, dive through enemy formations, and roll away before the Zeros could respond. Their 650 caliber Browning machine guns shredded unarmored Japanese aircraft with ruthless efficiency. The Pacific skies became an arena of imbalance, a war between a dying elegance and an industrial juggernaut. By 1944, Hellcats accounted for 75% of all aerial victories scored by U.S. Navy pilots. They destroyed nearly 5,200 Japanese aircraft for the loss of just 270 of their own in air-to-air combat. Those numbers weren't statistics. They were evidence of an empire losing its grip on the sky. Still, for the men in the cockpits, every dogfight remained a dance with death. The roar of engines, the smell of cordite, the sudden flash of sunlight on an enemy's wing, all were moments of eternity. Pilots described the shock of seeing Zeros disintegrate mid-air, their aluminum skins peeling away like paper. Others spoke of watching their enemies bail out, only to fall through the fire below. There was no hatred, only duty. "They fought with courage," said one American ace, but courage couldn't climb that high. The Japanese pilots who survived those encounters carried home tales of disbelief. Reports filed by naval aviators after the Battle of the Philippine Sea described the new American fighters as demons that rose from the clouds. One officer wrote that their own aircraft seemed to stand still while the enemy's rose like arrows. That sense of helplessness marked the end of Japan's aerial dominance. What had once been a contest of skill had become a contest of machinery, and in that contest Japan was already defeated. As the smoke cleared over the Marianas, carrier decks glistened with oil and victory. The Hellcats landed one by one, their wings folding like tired birds. Mechanics rushed forward, refueling, rearming, checking the bullet holes that had somehow not pierced their armor. Above them, the Pacific sky fell silent for the first time in years. Somewhere beyond that horizon, the surviving Japanese pilots limped back to their bases, haunted by what they had seen. They had faced a machine that seemed to defy nature itself, and the question burned through every squadron room across the empire. How could these Americans build a fighter that not only climbed faster, but fought without fear? The answer waited in the factories and design rooms thousands of miles away, where engineers had turned raw steel into supremacy. The next stage of the war would reveal their secret. The secret behind America's aerial supremacy did not lie in a single machine, but in an entire system of invention, testing, and relentless iteration. The Grumman F6F Hellcat was born not just from engineering brilliance, but from the lessons written in the blood of pilots who had faced the Zero and lived to tell the tale. Every bolt, every rivet, every curve on the Hellcat's frame carried the weight of those experiences. It was not merely a fighter plane. It was a response, a mechanical answer to the humiliation of 1942. Back in the spring of that year, American engineers had quietly begun collecting fragments of downed Zeros from the Aleutian Islands and the jungles of New Guinea. They studied the Japanese aircraft like archaeologists examining the bones of a predator. What they discovered astonished them. A light magnesium alloy frame, no armor plating, and fuel tanks with no self-sealing protection. The Zero's genius lay in its minimalism. It sacrificed protection for agility. But that same elegance would become its downfall once the United States learned how to strike faster and harder. When the engineers at Grumman compared the Zero's construction to the prototypes of the F6F, they realized something crucial. American pilots didn't need to turn tighter, they needed to survive longer. In the Grumman plant at Bethpage, thousands of men and women, known affectionately as the Grumman Iron Works, worked around the clock. Their factory floors glowed with sparks from welders and the rhythmic thunder of stamping presses. They built the Hellcat's airframe like a fortress, thick aluminum skin around the cockpit, bulletproof glass shielding the pilot's head, and self-sealing fuel tanks that swelled and hardened when hit by gunfire. The aircraft's massive wings were designed to fold for carrier operations, each controlled by hydraulic actuators that engineers tested to failure. Test pilot Robert Hall pushed the prototypes to their limits over Long Island Sound, deliberately stalling them, diving until the frame screamed. His flight logs later noted, "The aircraft recovers instinctively. She wants to live." It was a machine that forgave fear, the heart of the Hellcat. The Pratt & Dutch Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine was itself a masterpiece of American engineering. This 18-cylinder radial beast produced 2,000 horsepower at takeoff and could sustain high output even under tropical conditions that crippled Japanese engines. It featured two-stage supercharging, allowing it to breathe at altitudes where the Zero gasped for oxygen. Maintenance crews aboard carriers adored it for its reliability. They could strip and rebuild the engine with basic tools in hours. At full throttle, it pushed the Hellcat to 380 miles per hour and gave it the power to climb like a launched shell. "It's not flying," said one pilot after his first test flight. "It's defying gravity." As production ramped up, so did innovation. The U.S. Navy demanded not just a fighter, but a teaching tool. Flight instructors developed training programs using the Link Trainer simulators, allowing recruits to practice aerial maneuvers before ever leaving the ground. Radar-controlled intercepts were drilled until reflexive. In one exercise off Maui, instructors observed new pilots reacting to attack warnings within 6 seconds of detection, a pace the Japanese couldn't match. The Americans were transforming air combat into an industrial process, one where precision replaced instinct. The Japanese, meanwhile, were trapped in the past. Their aircraft factories, starved of resources and crippled by bombings, could barely maintain production. Engineers struggled to modernize the Zero's design, proposing upgrades like the A6M variant with a 1,560 horsepower engine. But raw materials were scarce. The aluminum alloys that once came from Manchuria were gone. Replacement metals warped under heat. Even the powerful Nakajima engines suffered from unreliable carburetors that caused sudden flameouts at high altitude. Japanese test pilots knew the truth. Their new prototypes couldn't match the Hellcat's climb or dive. One pilot wrote in his logbook that the Americans have found a way to make machines stronger than men. When the two forces finally met again over the Philippines, the difference was devastating. On October 24, 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, Task Force 38 launched waves of Hellcats from the carriers Essex, Lexington, and Enterprise. Their targets were the remnants of Japan's naval air arm, the same pilots who had once bombed Pearl Harbor. As the sun rose, the Hellcats climbed in formation, their engines roaring like an approaching storm. They intercepted Japanese bombers at 22,000 feet, diving from above with perfect coordination. The Zeros tried to turn and evade, but the Americans had learned to fight vertically. Instead of chasing, they looped upward, rolled, and came down again with crushing momentum. In just one day, the U.S. Navy claimed over 300 enemy aircraft destroyed. Pilots described the dogfights as chaos painted across a blue canvas, explosions, vapor trails, and falling debris turning the sky into a battlefield of fire. Among the survivors was Lieutenant Haruo Minoru, whose after-action notes would later be recovered by U.S. intelligence. He wrote, "Their fighters climb like mountains rising from the sea. We cannot reach them. When they dive, they strike like falling gods." His words captured the awe and terror felt by the Japanese pilots facing the Hellcat. For the first time in the war, they realized that bravery alone could not overcome engineering. The Americans, however, knew this dominance came at a cost. Every victory represented thousands of hours of labor by workers who never left the ground. At the Pratt & Whitney plant in Hartford, Connecticut, Women assembled the double Wasp engines with surgical precision, measuring tolerances down to fractions of a millimeter. In the Grumman paint shops, mechanics coated fuselages in deep navy blue to reflect the ocean below. Even the rivets were tested for stress resistance using X-ray inspection machines. No part of the Hellcat was left to chance. The result was a fighter that could be built in days, repaired in hours and flown by anyone with courage and training. On the battlefield, that reliability became legend. During a patrol near Formosa, pilot Eugene Valencia's Hellcat took 12 hits from anti-aircraft fire, lost an aileron, and still returned safely to the carrier. Maintenance logs show that his plane was patched and ready for flight within 48 hours. That resilience defined the American air strategy, machines that could outlast the war itself. By contrast, Japanese pilots often took off in planes so fragile they burst into flames after a single hit. Their courage was extraordinary, but their machines betrayed them. By late 1944, American carrier task forces dominated the Pacific skies. Each fleet operated as a floating city of industry, aircraft maintenance, refueling, radar coordination, and pilot debriefing all happening simultaneously. The Hellcat was the backbone of that system, the spearhead of an assembly line that stretched from New York to Guam. When one squadron returned with battle damage, replacements were already inbound by cargo ship. Japan could not comprehend the scale of such coordination. Their war had become a contest between craftsmanship and mass production had won, but technology alone did not end the Zero's reign. The final blow came from understanding. American pilots, once fearful of the Zero's agility, now exploited its weakness. They avoided horizontal turns, attacked from above, and forced the enemy into steep dives where their wings could not bear the strain. Training manuals called this the boom and zoom tactic, a simple phrase that rewrote the air war. Each engagement became predictable, efficient, and lethal. Japan's aces, once legends, now faced waves of younger, faster, and better-equipped opponents. By the close of 1944, the outcome was clear. The Hellcat had not just defeated the Zero, it had replaced it as the symbol of aerial supremacy. Japanese pilots who returned to their bases no longer spoke of dogfights but of survival. "They rule the skies now," one said in a dramatized reconstruction of intercepted radio traffic. Even the clouds belonged to them, and high above the Pacific, the Hellcats continued their climb, not just through the air, but into history itself. By early 1945, the sky over the Pacific no longer belonged to Japan. From the Marianas to Okinawa, the sound of American engines filled the heavens, a deep, throbbing chorus of steel and fire that drowned out the silence of defeat. The once feared Mitsubishi Zero, which had reigned supreme in 1941, was now obsolete. Its thin skin and aging engine no match for the brute force of the Grumman F6F Hellcat. For the men who built it, maintained it, and flew it, the Hellcat had become more than an aircraft. It was a declaration that the era of fragile brilliance had ended and the age of industrial power had begun. On the decks of the USS Enterprise, the Dawn Patrol prepared for takeoff. Mechanics worked in disciplined rhythm, tightening bolts, fueling tanks, and checking ammunition belts. The smell of gasoline and hot oil hung heavy in the morning air. Pilots climbed into cockpits, faces young but hardened by the war's unrelenting tempo. Their aircraft bore names scrawled in white paint. Paper Doll, Hell's Angel, Lucky Lady. Each was a machine born from thousands of hands, engineers, welders, riveters, and draftsmen, each one unknowingly linked to the pilots about to rise into battle. As the signal officer's flag dropped, propellers spun, engines howled, and one by one the Hellcats leapt into the rising sun. The Japanese airfields at Formosa, Okinawa, and Kyushu were already running dry. Aviation fuel reserves had collapsed to less than 10% of their pre-war levels. Replacement parts were scavenged from wrecks. Worn tires were patched with rope and glue. Air crews cannibalized the remains of old Zeros just to keep a handful flying. When radar screens aboard American carriers detected the first signs of enemy interceptors, controllers barely reacted. They knew what would follow. The same pattern repeated across every battle. The Zeros would appear low on the horizon, climbing desperately to intercept. The Hellcats, waiting miles above, would dive from the sun, guns blazing. The fight was over before it began. What made the Hellcat so decisive wasn't only its power or armor, it was its place in a vast system of production and logistics that Japan could no longer match. By 1945, the United States had built over 12,200 Hellcats. Each one had been tested, tracked, and deployed through an unbroken chain of supply stretching across continents and oceans. Carrier task forces operated like floating factories, with spare engines, propellers, and gun barrels stored in their bellies. Pilots rotated through combat and rest with mathematical precision. Japan, meanwhile, was forced to send its last cadets, barely trained, sometimes only 17 years old, into battle in aircraft that burned before they climbed above the clouds. In those final months, the psychological toll became unbearable for Japan's airmen. Pilots wrote farewell letters, knowing their chances of survival were nearly zero. Some recorded that they could see the Americans before they could even reach combat altitude, their opponents gleaming in the sunlight above them. "They descend upon us like falcons upon mice," wrote one young aviator in his final diary entry. "Their wings flash, and the sky becomes fire." The Imperial Navy turned increasingly to desperation, training kamikaze units to crash into American ships, a strategy born not of fanaticism alone but of despair. The Zeros that once ruled the sky had become weapons of suicide, while the Hellcats continued to hunt and return home. For the American pilots, the war became both mechanical and personal. Many felt no joy in victory, only the weight of necessity. They respected their adversaries, often describing the Japanese flyers as courageous but doomed. One Hellcat pilot recalled seeing a Zero pilot bail out, his parachute burning in midair. "He looked up once," he said, "and then he was gone. I didn't feel triumph. I felt old." Behind every triumph was loss, comrades shot down, planes vanishing into the sea, letters never sent. But they knew the end was near, and every sortie brought the world closer to peace. The engineers and factory workers who had made the Hellcat possible rarely saw their contribution in headlines. Yet their work shaped history as much as any battle. At the Grumman plant, engineers like Bill Schwendler had labored through nights to perfect the Hellcat's control surfaces, balancing lift and stability until the plane responded like an extension of the pilot's will. Women welders at Bethpage riveted fuselages with calloused hands and aching backs, working 12-hour shifts. At Pratt & Whitney, technicians assembled double Wasp engines under strict tolerances, each one inspected by teams of engineers with slide rules and microscopes. These people, far from the front lines, had forged the weapon that broke the Empire's back. In reports written after the war, Admiral Mark Mitcher would call them the quiet heroes of the Pacific. As the Hellcats dominated the skies, their influence reshaped air warfare itself. Before them, aerial combat had been a contest of reflexes and courage. After them, it became a science of engineering, logistics, and information. The Hellcat wasn't built for acrobatics. It was built for control, for survivability, for mass production. Its design philosophy echoed into the jet age, influencing aircraft like the F-86 Sabre and F-14 Tomcat decades later. It proved that a machine could embody both strength and precision, that reliability could be deadlier than beauty. In many ways, the Hellcat was the industrial revolution of aerial combat. The Japanese military recognized this too late. Captured documents from 1945 revealed urgent directives to develop new interceptors, like the Mitsubishi J2M Raiden and Kawanishi N1K. Shiden Kai, planes designed to counter the Hellcat's climb and dive performance. But it was already over. Factories lacked aluminum, engines failed from poor lubrication, and the once proud engineering corps was dispersed by air raids. The Empire's industrial machine had collapsed under the same weight that had once powered its war. The sky had become not a battlefield, but a graveyard for ambition. When Japan finally surrendered in August 1945, the Hellcat stood as the symbol of a new kind of warfare, a weapon not of genius alone but of coordination. It represented the unbreakable link between pilot, engineer, and worker. On VJ Day, photographs from carrier decks show young aviators grinning beside their planes, the salt wind whipping their flight suits. Behind them, written in chalk on one Hellcat's fuselage, were the words "Built by Bethpage, flown by freedom." That sentiment carried the truth of the war's end, the realization that victory had been crafted as much in the factory as in the sky. The legacy of the Hellcat lived long beyond. 1945, it became a training aircraft, a testbed for radar systems, and eventually a museum relic, a monument to the moment when American engineering outclimbed empire. The lessons it taught shaped not only aircraft design, but the philosophy of modern warfare. In Korea, Vietnam, and the Gulf, the principle endured, technological dominance sustained by industrial power. The Hellcat had proven that wars are not only fought by men, but by the societies that build behind them. Looking back, the story of the Hellcat is not merely one of machines, but of transformation. It marked the shift from romantic combat to calculated supremacy. The sky that once rewarded agility and instinct now bowed to precision and mass. The Japanese pilots who first faced the Hellcat called it the monster of the clouds. To them, it was an omen, a signal that their age was ending. When the final Hellcats returned home, streaked with oil and salt, they carried the ghosts of both victors and vanquished. The war they had fought had rewritten the laws of flight and forever changed the balance of power. Their engines quieted, their wings folded. They stood in silence on carrier decks as the Pacific winds blew across the decks they once ruled. In the decades that followed, one lesson remained, etched in every report, every memory, every museum display. In modern war, strength is not in speed alone, but in the will to build faster, adapt faster, and climb higher than your enemy. And the Hellcat, climbing through clouds that once belonged to the rising sun, proved that sometimes victory does not roar. It ascends.